Welcome students to lecture 13 of MHHS 1. We're moving back in history a bit from the 21st century to the late 18th century and early 19th century, or what is commonly known as the Romantic era. That hopefully provides some explanation for the title of my essay, Romantic Disease Discourse, Disability, Immunity, and Literature. I published this essay when I was a graduate student at UCLA while writing my dissertation on smallpox vaccination. So I'll give you some context for where this work ended up and the avenues it opened up for me in terms of future research. Again, as with Susan Zeger's piece that we talked about in lectures 9 and 10, I want to steer you away from reading these articles as self-contained, closed arguments. Instead, think of them as open invitations for further thinking and further research. They should provoke something and suggest that there is a lot of further work to be done. Another reason I'm assigning this piece is to preview another class that I teach within the MHHS program, English 141 on Literature and Disability. So if this material interests you at all, I encourage you to sign up for that course as well when it's offered. The next two lectures will have a familiar structure by now because I'll do something like how we discussed Susan Zeger's piece. First, I'll give you some context for the larger book-length argument. This essay was published in 2011. It ended up being part of a chapter in my book published in 2023, 12 whole years later. And second, I'll focus on the broad strokes of the specific arguments within the essay. And in the next lecture, in lecture 14, we'll get into those detailed close readings and textual evidence. So at this point, and with all of your new reading tools, I hope that you feel like you're getting better at reading, understanding, and engaging with these academic articles. As I mentioned, this was published when I was a PhD student at UCLA, and this ended up being a part of my dissertation. The dissertation is now a book called The Smallpox Report, Vaccination, and the Romantic Illness Narrative, published by the University of Toronto Press in May 2023. The book was started way before the pandemic, when I was in graduate school, but its vaccination focus has become unexpectedly relevant. So the elevator pitch version of the argument is that the discovery of the smallpox vaccine in 1798 was as much a literary discovery as a medical one. So this is a very MHHS argument that blends medical science and humanities approaches. So what it's doing is it's revising a little bit of received medical history. The received medical history is one that valorizes Dr. Edward Jenner's inquiry concerning the variola vaccinae, published in 1798, to the complete exclusion of the larger medical literary culture of the British Romantic era, from which the discovery emerged. Apart from Jenner, Romantic era medicine doesn't seem to have a great reputation. What we do is we tend to look back at that era and then we laugh at how ridiculous they were. When it comes to Romantic medicine, we're used to talking about strange electromagnetic beds for fertility issues and nitrous oxide experiments for lung disorders. Really hilarious stuff. So it was, in this view, an age of quackery, and Jenner just barely escaped that barbarity by the skin of his teeth. So that's usually what we think of this period. My argument in the book works to change that usual historical script. The story of vaccination as a kind of Enlightenment diamond in the rough that somehow rose above Romantic medicine's culture of backwardness is wrong, and perhaps more importantly, dangerous. So first, the wrong. Milkmaids, for example, already knew that handling cowpox-infected udders would confer immunity to the human smallpox virus. And there are anecdotes of cowpox inoculation from as early as the 1770s. So this is not a story of miraculous discovery then, but of the medical writing that made vaccination plausible, available, and desirable. So it's a story about how disease and treatment were reported, hence the title of the book, The Smallpox Report. And it's a story about what that reporting looked like, hence the book's subtitle focusing on illness narratives. Romantic era medical writing might look strange to us, so I organized my chapters into 3 parts to describe the 3 defining properties of what I have called romantic disease discourse, the main gist of the essay that you read for today. The first is about classification and the romantic illness narrative's reluctance to strictly distinguish between healthy and sick, the normal and the abnormal. The second is about experimentation and the romantic illness narrative's bold research methods. The third property is about interdisciplinarity and the romantic illness narrative's blurring of the lines between patient and physician, between folk knowledge and between folk knowledge and professional experience. So I claim in the book that these illness narratives, and not just Jenner himself, pieced together the real story of vaccination. So I said the usual story was both wrong and dangerous. So second, let's get back to why the conventional history of Jenner and vaccination might be dangerous. So towards the end of the book, in part 4, I get back to more familiar territory in the contemporary moment, in the story of inoculation as an argument for biopower or the top-down state control of public health. So by the late 19th century, the physician had taken on the role of the Holmesian detective, as I talked about with Susan Zeger's argument about Holmes and media addiction. So the physician, he could observe the invisible, and like Sherlock Holmes, the physician could make connections that you just couldn't. He was just better than you. So this is the conventional history that elevates Jenner to supreme conqueror of smallpox, and it's also the ultimate justification for the rational liberal state's control over immunized bodies. Now, to a certain extent, this actually makes a lot of sense. We should trust the experts in their fields. It makes a lot of sense. This should have been a winning argument, but we know that it wasn't. Smallpox was eradicated, but measles and pertussis, for example, are making an unnecessary comeback because of a strengthening anti-vaccination movement. And we all know now, after living through a seemingly unending pandemic, about the problem of what is now called vaccine hesitancy. So somehow, that winning biopolitical argument is somehow losing. This is why I think the usual Jenner story is dangerous. If the argument is just about biopower, about the state's controls of our bodies, then the movement continues and our dangerous exposure to vaccine-preventable diseases increases. So we've tried things like brute force biopower, and it doesn't work. So we have to try something else. And this essay is a first attempt at that something else. Like we're used to doing by now, we'll just focus on the first and last sections of the essay to get the bird's eye view of the argument. So the essay opens with 2 conflicting views of the classifications of diseases and disorders. So from a medical scientific perspective, it would seem like a no-brainer to have clear definitional categories that would expedite treatment. And to a certain extent, it is a good thing. As the essay mentions, these kinds of classification schemes have led to decreased mortality and better health outcomes. But there's another side to this. But there are potential dangers here as well, as I explained with the very clear example of the DSM's inclusion of homosexuality as a mental disorder. Having these efficient categories is useful, yes, but we also have to think about who is in charge of defining these categories. So this insight, this has been an important insight to disability studies and has led to its resistance to the over-medicalization of the human body-mind. So the common controversial example that I always give is that of Down syndrome. So on one side, from a seemingly objective medical scientific perspective, it would seem like it would be best if we eliminated a, quote, syndrome from the world. naming it a disease, a disorder, or a syndrome targets it automatically for elimination, rehabilitation, or cure. And countries like Iceland have already started to implement programs to end Down syndrome births by mandating aggressive genetic screening. But if you actually ask people with Down syndrome or parents of children with Down syndrome, most would actually view themselves or their children positively as just different models of human flourishing rather than defective models of human flourishing. Genetic eradication would mean to them a devaluing of their lives and experiences from a class of people who actually have no idea what it's like to live with trisomy 21. Just because you can't imagine anyone valuing this non-normative life doesn't mean that you can legislate it out of existence, is what they would say. So back to this, the importance of naming and classifying. If it were called something like that, like trisomy 21, meaning a third copy of chromosome 21, think about how the ethical calculus about eradication already starts to sound a little bit different. Just by removing it from the classification of syndrome, this, I claim, is already making the issue a whole lot murkier. So when I talked about immunity's origins in the essay, I don't mean some kind of medical scientific definition that arrives from above. No, not like that. No, it's much more like what Ziegler was talking about in the construction of the figure of addiction. So there are a ton of cultural forces that grew up around the concept of immunity that make it what it is today, just like with addiction in Ziegler's essay. Foucault, for example, highlights the arbitrariness of the concept in his historicization of plague and leprosy, which is now known as Hansen's disease. So he asked, why is it that the plague victim gets accommodation while the leper is cast out into a far-off colony? Immunity now frequently implies a kind of sterility, a purging of all bad things from good society. But as I'll be arguing in the essay, immunity's origins, both medically, culturally, and metaphorically, are much closer to the images of contamination, filth, and disease. So to make this lost origin of immunity clear, the essay uses the representative example of Mary Shelley's apocalyptic plague novel, The Last Man, which was published in 1826. The claim is that something changes dramatically between Shelley's novel and Charles Dickens's novel Bleak House, published sometime between 1852 and 1853. So what I talked about before, that sanitized discourse around immunity, emerges from Dickens's later Victorian age, when we've developed the contemporary view of medical problems, diseases, debilities, and disabilities as things that can be just cleanly eradicated and purged so that we can arrive at a comforting authoritarian image of antibacterial sterility. So all of the outlying scariness of immunity has been cured and eradicated. The only thing left inside is this perfectly clean ideal of health. That's the Victorian model. So this essay will rewind us back in time to show how fragile this fantasy of sterile immunity actually is. In the last section of the essay, we've arrived at that familiar Victorian fantasy of sanitary health. In Bleak House, it doesn't even matter to Dickens what disease the narrator, Esther Summerson, has. What matters is that her scarred skin, she may have either smallpox or erysipelas, her scarred skin has completely healed by the end in a purely metaphorical manifestation of the happy social ending of the novel. This comforting, easy binary of disease and cure is what has survived into our modern medical institutions. And that is why disability studies scholars and activists are so skeptical of even the word medical. So what that means to disabled folks is that their lives are mere impairments in search of medical rehabilitation. They are something bad that needs to be fixed. This kind of medicalization has historically told Black men, for example, that their lives can be sacrificed for the greater good of public health. It has told deaf people that they have no significant culture besides pure deficit. It has told people with Down syndrome that medicine is very close to fixing the world so that no one will ever have to live like them again. So that is why disability studies scholars and activists have been rightly resistant to even institutional formulations like MHHS. The very presence of that word medical in MHHS for them is already a bright red flag. But what this paper suggests is that it hasn't always been like this. Professional medicine wasn't always in search of the fastest route from perceived deficit or defect to medical recuperation or cure. What this paper offers at the end is a way for the medical and health humanities to talk productively to disability studies, to offer a bridge between these two fields. By romantic disease discourse, I mean to offer a forgotten, positive historical precedent when medicine actually valued individual narratives and the stories that people constructed around the slippery notion of health. So in the end, I offer these three properties of romantic disease discourse to show that disability studies can look to medical history with more than just unwavering suspicion. What I want to emphasize here is something that we learned a while ago from Annika Speer's essay several lectures ago. There, I wanted you to learn early to be wary of those progress narratives that assume that we are always getting better, we're always getting smarter with medicine. And as with Annika Speer's essay, we learned that about the overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022. And we learned that progress is frequently just a comforting illusion. What I want to offer here is that the past isn't always just this conception of a dark age that we're lucky to have gotten out of. Yes, we now know about genes and germs, and that's an amazing thing that has had a tangible positive impact on our contemporary health outcomes. But we have also lost the kind of medical literary language that came with the Romantic era's pre-professionalized and pre-institutionalized medicine. Romantic disease discourse's resistance to normative classifications, its radical experimentalism, and its interdisciplinary language made it surprisingly agile and radically accepting of what we would now call non-normative embodiments. It could imagine radically diverse forms of human flourishing and, at the same time, develop vaccination, perhaps medical history's greatest success story. So perhaps it isn't just a dark age in the history of medicine that we should forget.